Hey guys, I'm Inverse, and welcome to the first in a series of US versus Panzer Elite case studies. This is going to be a little bit different from my build order breakdown series in that each episode is going to be a self-contained look at a single strategy, and I'm going to be doing a number of these over the next few days and few weeks. My main goal with this series is to give American players who I know have been struggling immensely against Panzer Elite this patch with a few different, perhaps lesser known and a little bit more difficult to execute strategies to try out and play around with if they're feeling a little bit frustrated with the current state of the matchup or with their ability to play that matchup. Of course, standard builds such as 4 rifle into fast M8, stuff like that, is always going to be, they're always going to be there. And for new players, I would absolutely recommend you try those builds before you try some of the builds that I'm going to be going over in these series. This build, for example, is a build shown to me by ctseok, who is a Korean player who played on the Clan Reloaded for a while, was a level 20 American player on the leaderboards for a very, very long time, and had a lot of success with this strategy in particular against Panzer Elite. The strategy in question is a 3 rifle start with 2 engineers, a standard start up to there, and then a medic tent near your cutoff, a triage center as soon as you can, a supply yard soon after that, and then the first supply yard upgrade using Paratroopers as stopgap AT until you can get airdropped AT guns and perhaps even tank depot tech out at a later time. It's a fairly difficult strategy to execute, and it has weaknesses. It is difficult to play against armored car play, and it is very, very easy, relatively speaking, of course, against most everything else. Of course, armored cars are fairly popular nowadays, so that is a slight issue, but there are ways to get around it, and I'll hopefully be pointing out some of those as we go on. So let's get things started for now, and I'm just going to kind of talk about the maps for this strategy as we take a look at the opening. This game, by the way, will be against Seth, the very, very popular player playing Panzer Elite, of course, on the south of Langra. In terms of maps, I personally have found, and based on the games from ctseok that I have watched, that Langra is absolutely the best map for this strategy. The main reason for that is it's fairly small, so you can force a lot of fights, which is what you really want to be doing with this strategy. This strategy relies on you dealing a lot of manpower damage in the early game, getting a lot of veterancy, and using that to boost up into the mid and late game. It's very, very easy to force fights on this map, which makes it very, very nice. It's fairly narrow. You have a lot of cover up here. You have these 2 houses, which can be used to great effect, and your cutoff is extremely close to your HQ. Especially from the top. It's a little further away from the bottom since this is going to be the main cutoff, but from the top it's right here, and this is where you're going to want to be putting your med tent, but we'll talk about that a little bit more when the situation arises. I'm going to be showing you guys 3 games today, 2 games from ctseok and 1 game of my own. Hopefully give you guys a fairly broad understanding of how this strategy works in general. I'm not very good at it myself, relatively speaking, of course. I have had some mild success with it, but it is a very, very difficult strategy to execute. It relies on making intelligent decisions in the early game when fighting Panzer Grenadiers, and any mistakes in the early game when fighting Panzer Grenadiers are going to result in a lot of difficulties because of the very, very high damage output of the Panzer Grenadiers, and the fact that you can be really caught out of position and take a lot of damage if you make any sort of really, really big blunders in the early game. So as we see, ctseok doing his best to try to cap this fuel point. not too concerned about it. This strategy is more about denying your opponent fuel than it is capping it for yourself. You are going to want to be focusing on munitions a lot, and the main reason for that is you need to be able to get a paratrooper with a recoilless rifle out as soon as possible. Your main issue is going to be a fast armored car, and while paratroopers aren't exactly excellent against fast armored cars or armored cars in general, provided you micro your infantry well and position properly, you can absolutely defend an early armored car rush. Now the first game here, we're not going to have our opponent do an armored car rush, we're going to have our opponent do something else, and you're going to see the power of the strategy against an opponent who decides to deviate from the fast armored car play. It's extremely powerful and extremely useful to have this strategy in your arsenal against a player who elects to skip armored cars or tech to a higher tech or blind counter an M8. Anything like that is extremely difficult to beat. That didn't make any sense. It's extremely difficult to beat this strategy with any of those. There we go, that's a little better. So we see the med tent coming up right now. Notice the positioning of this med tent. You really want this med tent as close to your cutoff as possible while still being able to defend it. And the main reason for that is you absolutely need to be able to hold your cutoff in the early game with this strategy. You don't have a shock unit in the form of an armored car or anything like that. So if your opponent is able to cut you off for a decent period of time and camp behind green cover or something like that, you're going to spend a lot of manpower trying to get him out of that cover and trying to regain your cutoff. When in this situation, you're able to fight near your barracks here, you're able to deal a lot of damage, and you force your opponent to decide between shooting the medics, which means they're dealing less damage to your rifles, or shoot your infantry, in which case your medics are going to be able to pick up a lot of bodies, and it becomes very, 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 very effective. Now the main reason it is so effective getting this med tent in the early game is the fact that we're going to be getting a very, very quick supply yard upgrade. The very quick supply yard upgrade does two things. First, obviously it gives you that increase in manpower in the early game, but secondly, it really, really boosts your veterancy, and it allows you to support 4 and even 5 rifle squads along with paratroopers in the early game with decent map control. Late game, you're of course going to want the second supply yard upgrade and all sorts of stuff like that, but the first supply yard upgrade is an excellent base in the very, very early game, especially considering how early we're going to want to be getting it with this strategy. As we notice, pushing off our Panzer Elite player right now in the middle, we have a triage center back at the base, so any sort of straight chip damage is going to be largely negated, and a early triage center is absolutely amazing against Panzer Elite if you can afford it. Most fast M8 or fast tech builds don't have room for the triage center simply because it's such a manpower investment. Not so much the fuel. 20 fuel in the early game can be a big deal against PE if you're going for a super fast M8, but generally speaking it's not really a big deal. It's the manpower that you're really going to be concerned about. And in a strategy such as this, where you're sacrificing that third rifle for the med tent and banking on the fact that that med tent, provided you support it correctly, is going to give you a free squad eventually, which it almost always does, and then investing in this triage center, which will help you out immensely in the late game simply because it gives you an enormous boost in manpower because you're reinforcing a lot less, especially against Panzer Elite, where you can find yourself in a lot of situations with incendiary grenades and incendiary traps and even just regular PE skirmishes like this. You're going to have a lot of very, very low health squads that haven't actually lost many squad members, and in situations like that you absolutely want to be healing them in order to save that manpower and most importantly save that time, because you don't want to be retreating, wasting your time back at base and all that kind of stuff. You want to be able to get back, repair, or heal up rather, and get back out on the field as soon as possible. Now we see the AT half-track on the field for Seth. So at this point, as the American player, this is your ideal situation. A unit that really doesn't have too much utility against anything you are fielding right now. Of course, it does have utility against against infantry in the sense that it can focus fire and stuff like that, but in general it's not nearly as effective at that as an armored car is. And we'll see a little bit later the challenges that an armored car presents to this strategy and the ways you can kind of work around it. It's never very comfortable, but it's always doable provided you play correctly and you play intelligently and you make correct decisions. Now, as we see, getting the supply rate up right now, if we look at the fuel right here, fairly close to 50. You generally want to get this and finish this when you're around 50 fuel, so you can get that early supply rate upgrade as soon as possible. Now, as we can see, our American player is allowed, or able really, to be super duper aggressive with this opening, and mainly that is because of the triage center and the fact that he has so much extra manpower because he's been forced to reinforce far less. He's been on the field a lot more, and he's been dealing a lot more damage to his opponent because his opponent has not gotten healing yet, and he has been taking a lot more manpower damage from his Panzer Grenadiers as a result, because they've of course been dying a lot easier. Now, we also noticed a 4th rifle squad come out from ctseok. This is something that varies largely based on the early game and based on how you play out the early game and how it ends up shaping out. If you find yourself with a surplus of manpower in the super early game, you've played fairly well, you have decent map control, and you're not really being forced to reinforce too much, it's never ever a bad idea to get that 4th rifle squad. It doesn't really impact your manpower income in terms of upkeep too much, especially because we're going to be getting that really fast supply yard upgrade. And it gives you a little bit more map presence, and of course gives you more damage output, more units that can feed the med station and stuff like that. So it's never a bad idea if you can afford it. Here we see the first supply rate upgrade coming up. Could have been a little bit earlier, but that's not too big a deal. Fairly good map control situation for ctseok, and this is kind of the situation Panzer Elite players find themselves in when they haven't gone fast AC against a strategy such as this. It's very difficult without an armored car to deal too much damage to a strategy such as this. It has such mobility and such strength in the early game, which is generally the realm of the Panzer Elite player. But in a situation such as this, where our American player has a lot of rifles, all of them with a lot of health, has a lot of manpower to spend on reinforcements, which means he can reinforce his squads and get them out on the field far sooner, has a focus on munitions, which means we have recoilless rifles coming out soon. We have 2 flamers, I believe 2 flamers in the early game, as well as recoilless rifles, which is extremely important for a strategy such as this, which relies so much on infantry. You want to get as much out of that infantry as you possibly can. And Hotchkiss, never see Hotchkiss, but it's Cepha, so of course he's going to build him. But yeah, Paratroopers coming down on the field right now. A lot of infantry for our American player, and a lot of fairly solid map control as well. You'll notice a strategy such as this against what ctseok's opponent is doing forces his opponent to play passively. If he plays too aggressively, he completely plays into the hands of the American player and allows the American player to gain veterancy, most importantly, which is absolutely the point of this very early supply rate upgrade, is to to facilitate early veterancy gain. Of course, in addition to giving him a little bit of extra manpower income, which is never a bad thing either. So at this point, without armored cars on the field, these airborne with recoilless rifles are going to be absolutely godly at anti-tank. Airborne with recoilless rifles are probably the best mobile AT you can really get against Panzer Elite, unless the Panzer Elite player has armored cars. Armored cars phase through, of course, just like they phase through Pumas. Recoilless rifles, that is, phase through Pumas and stuff like that. Armored cars as well, and it's relatively difficult to handle armored cars with this strategy. which is something to keep in mind if you're a player who has difficulty handling armored cars with a standard US versus PE. Might not be the strategy you want to be trying consistently. I'm going to be showcasing a few other strategies that might be a little bit better for a player who would rather have tech and rely on that for anti-tank instead of relying on paratroopers, which can be finicky, can be expensive, can be difficult to use, and you really have to know what you're doing and know how to use them in order to get the most use out of a unit such as the paratroopers. So at this point, ctseok, a lot of map control, decent amount of veterancy. We have 2 single bars and a single bar on this engineer squad. We have a lot of resources in the bank, which is not a bad idea with a strategy such as this. It's very manpower intensive, and it's very it is very expensive to reinforce all of your squads. So keeping a slight manpower bank is never a terrible idea. You're always going to have to be reinforcing, and you're going to want to wait for manpower as little as possible. So keeping that bank is definitely something you can be doing. I'm just going to fast forward things a little bit. Get to the super late game. There's not really too much to talk about past the very, very early game with this strategy. It kind of turns into a fairly standard game, very infantry heavy, of course, and it turns into the standard questions American players have to ask themselves when playing, like when can I get upgrades I want while remaining safe against things my opponent has. Like, as you'll notice right now, we're just now getting stickies and bars, which is fairly late, but we've had to keep this manpower bank up just a little bit so that we can maintain a field presence, especially with these paratroopers. If we allow our opponent to push out too far on the map, we could have a more difficult time taking it back, and taking it back in a cost-effective manner where you're not losing a ton of manpower, because until you can get that second supply yard upgrade out, the strategy is fairly difficult to maintain full unit presence with all of your units, especially if you have 2 airborne squads and stuff like that. Now, as we see, ctseok managing to push out. He's keeping his units together, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You'd never want to keep them too close together because mortars and stuff like that can really do a number. But it's never a bad idea to keep your units fairly close together, at least relatively speaking, of course. Cutting off our opponent, killing stuff, running away. A little bit more veterancy coming up. We've got a Vet 2 squad over here. If we look back at the base, mostly reinforcing once again. A lot of fuel, but you're going to float fuel a lot of the time against this strategy, or with this strategy rather. Fuel can be very, very important in the late game if your opponent transitions into armored cars, or if he even opened with armored cars, because your ideal follow-up is going to be tank depot tech, if you can afford it, of course. If you can't afford it, you're going to find yourself in a difficult spot against armored cars, and that's the main problem I see with this strategy, is figuring out when you need those tanks and when you can squeeze them in, because anything this infantry intensive, this infantry heavy, is going to be very, very expensive in terms of manpower. And what else is very expensive in terms of manpower? Tank depot tech. Tank depot is very, very expensive, relatively speaking, of course, in terms of manpower. 350 manpower for the building, and between 300 and 420 manpower for units. That's a lot of manpower if you're reinforcing 4+ rifle squads, 5 now since we had a free squad come out of this med tent, plus 2 paras, a para, a few engineers, and only 1 supplier upgrade. We do see the second supplier upgrade coming out right now. But that, of course, is very fuel intensive, so if you don't do a good job of maintaining a solid fuel income through the mid game, you can find yourself in a sticky situation. But as we can see here, ctseok does a fairly good job of balancing his manpower spending with his tech, his reinforcing with his upgrades and stuff like that, and that's really what it's going to take to be successful with a strategy such as this. You're going to find it fairly difficult in the early goings, because it's just a different style, and it's not really a quote-unquote standard way to play. You don't see many players doing this, especially now that ctseok actually does not play very much anymore. This replay in particular, I believe, is 6 to 8 months old or something like that. Now, of course, things do change in the metagame. A lot more players are going fast ACs these days, which is perfectly fine. Just takes a little bit of adjusting, as I mentioned before, and as we will find in subsequent episodes, or not episodes rather, but games in this single episode. But let's just speed things up a little bit. Watch strafes kill stuff. Reinforcing, got a weapon support center out, which is always a good idea against a player who counters this strategy with heavy infantry play. Lots of PGs, or even just the absence of tier 3 and the absence of armored cars, makes snipers extremely powerful. Against the player who does go tier 3, you're generally not going to want to focus too much on snipers, even if your opponent does go for a lot of Panzer Grenadiers, because they're so fragile and they die just so easily to armored cars that you really don't want to rely on an expensive unit such as that when it can be countered so easily by what your opponent has on the field. So stuff's pushing up. As we notice, the victory point's fairly good for our American player, and that's a benefit of this super aggressive style of play. Just the fact that you're always on the map, you're always being active, you're always forcing your opponent to react to you, and that gives you a lot of opportunities to gain veterancy, to push your opponent off, to cap points very frequently, and to be very, very mobile and very, very fluid. You don't need to base a defense around immobile AT guns, say, because you have mobile AT in the form of the Paratrooper, and you have mobility from your infantry in terms of a lot of infantry squads, rifle squads, with veterancy. So that's really all I wanted to show you from game number 1. We're going to jump into game number 2, which is going to be a Samoa game, where we're going to see a fast AC, and we're going to see how ctseok reacts to that. I'll see you guys on the other side. Alright guys, welcome back. We're going to take a look now at a Samoa game. We got ctseok up here in the north, and his opponent will be ctseok-style, who is a relatively active ladder PE player. Plays a lot of PE, plays a lot of Brits as well. And we're going to take a look at how ctseok likes to react to a fast armored car, which is what our Panzer Elite player, ctseok, is going to be going for this game. So if we look at this map for this strategy, it's, in my opinion, an alright one. Not nearly as good as Langra, because you don't really have the cutoff that you can fight for. But you do have a lot of green cover in the middle. You have a lot of buildings that you can stall in. And you can spread out a lot to harass your opponent, or force your opponent to fight by pushing for a cutoff, pushing for his fuel, or pushing for the middle, something like that. Furthermore, it's fairly easy, relatively speaking, to delay an armored car in the mid game, because you have, once again, a lot of buildings and a lot of green cover in this middle area, which makes rifles fairly effective against against armored cars, as long as you're in some sort of cover and in a decent enough number, and when combined with paratroopers, makes it extremely effective in the early game. Now, it's, as we're going to see, not entirely set in stone, of course. It's still uncomfortable, and it's still something that you absolutely have to be conscious of whenever you play this strategy. Now, speaking a bit more to the design of maps that lends itself to this strategy, in terms of maps that I feel are not good for this strategy, Bow Lowlands for one, because your opponent can really spread out and completely avoid fights, and you don't really have any single area to contend for, like you have with the cutoff on Angleville, the cutoff on Langra, and even this middle area on Samoa kind of doubles as that kind of situation. So Bow Lowlands, in my opponent, a very bad map for this this strategy. Another bad map, in my opinion, is Stursdorf, just because of the same kind of principles. There's not really one single area you really want to focus on Stursdorf. You want to be as mobile as possible, harassing and decapping, flanking, stuff like that, on a map like Stursdorf where there's so much fuel spread out everywhere. And you don't really want to be fighting a lot on that map. That's a very good American map against Panzer Elite, in my opinion. And I find the standard plays to work perfectly fine on a map like that, where you can just be super mobile, super annoying, and do a lot of damage, both in terms of manpower and in terms of fuel economy, to your opponent in that way, without having to invest in a strategy that could potentially cause difficulties against something your opponent could do. So as we see right now, ctseok getting 2 rifles out on the field right now, keeping his units around the middle, keeping them out of harm's way right now. He does not want to engage this with a single rifle squad. He will engage it with 2 rifle squads and an engineer, however. This is definitely a favorable engagement for him, especially with the Panzer Grenadiers split up a little bit. You always want to fight PGs when they're as split up as possible, and you always want to focus fire the low health squads, which ctseok isn't really doing a good job of right now. However, with 3 rifle squads and an engineer, that's not going to be a problem at all. And whoops, he's actually going to be able to chase these down and probably kill. Actually, no, he is going to be able to kill a single PG squad. Now that's a very, very big win in the early game, especially for this strategy, because it makes every subsequent battle far easier. You have a lot more infantry relative to your opponent. You have a lot more mobility. You have a lot more strength. And you have the ability to put aggression on without having to risk a strong counterattack that will deal a lot of damage to you. Such as this situation right here, being able to cut off this resource point, which actually isn't connecting too much right now if we look at the tactical map, just this plus 16 fuel. However, it's still a powerful position to be in order to be able to push up this far and deny a cutoff point such as that. Now we have 4 rifles coming up straight away for this strategy on this map. This is not a bad idea because we have so many buildings in the middle, which makes a fast armored car a little bit less scary, and you don't really have to rely on paratroopers or heavy forms of AT against armored cars on this map, because you can delay a lot in church, in this building, even this building right here, and in all the green cover in the middle, especially when you're ahead in terms of infantry squads. Pushing your advantage,
Enemy unit down.
losing another grenadier right there, pushing your advantage with further infantry squads is never a bad idea. I'm just going to speed things up a little bit, get to the armored car. Armored cars coming. If we look in the base, we have the triage center coming up. We're going to have the supply yard coming up afterwards. Adhering to that part of the build order, of course, the one part that is flexible is that number of Panzer Grenadiers in the early game. PE player pushing in the middle. We're going to see armored cars show up. Don't make me a liar. I know you're in here. I know you're coming. I know you're coming. You're coming. Kim. One more speed up. Maybe that'll help. Maybe 4x is the key. Now you'll notice a very, very late med tent in this situation. And that was because we got the faster 4th Rifle Squad. If you get a faster 4th Rifle Squad, you're absolutely going to want to delay that med tent, because you're not necessarily going to want to be relying on earlier zombie rifle squads, because you already have that 4 rifle base, and any further rifle squads are going to negatively impact your manpower rate. And until you can get a supply yard with the supply yard upgrade out, you're not really going to want to exceed 4 rifles. Now we do have the AC coming out right now. However, if we look at the manpower and munitions right now, we have plenty for a paratrooper, we have plenty for the reinforcements, and with this triage center, that's going to strongly negate the armored car's ability to deal damage in the base like this. he's going to have to deal damage on the field and stuff like that. And by now our American player has such a dominating control over the map that it really doesn't matter too much what this armored car does. As we notice, the kind of proper quote-unquote response to this is to keep your infantry together as much as possible. We have a para squad coming out that should be upgraded with recoilless soon, and it's really using the cover and architecture of the map to your advantage. This is why Samoa can be a very, very good map for this strategy, simply because you have a lot of this cover. As I mentioned before, you have a lot of these buildings, and even if you don't necessarily use the buildings, you can be using the cover and you can force off these armored cars and force off your opponent's infantry. And from this point, it's pretty much going to be, that sucks. No, finish capping. But yeah, this is pretty much going to be game. Not necessarily the best example of this strategy working against the fast armored car. You do have to take into account the fact that our Panzer Elite player lost two Panzer Grenadier squads in the super early game, and was fairly careless with his first armored car, driving it right into the base to kill a rifle squad, which was good, but then he lost it right here, and he took a lot of damage on it as well. But that's going to be game 2. And with that armored car dead, we're going to go on to our third and final game. Alright guys, we're back. This is going to be a game between myself down at the bottom of Langra and Silence, playing as this jumble of characters up here in the top of Langra. And we're going to see a fairly similar style of play to ctseok, play from the top. However, there are going to be some slight modifications. Of course, the med tent placement is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be down here. And the reason for that is this is the main cutoff I want to be pushing for. And I'm going to want to have that med tent as close to that cutoff as safely as possible. So it's going to be down here. And aside from that, it plays out fairly standard in the early game. The general early focus is of course going to be on the strat point and on my ability to maintain control of this fuel point, and more importantly the munitions points here, here, and down here. These are going to give me the munitions I need to field a early flamer, which is very, very important when trying to break cutoff camps, and also allow me to get a fairly quick recoilless rifle squad, which is important obviously against any sort of quick or even semi-quick vehicle play. So just a pretty standard capping order coming out right now. Not too much to talk about. Let's speed things up a little bit, get to the action, get to the bloodshed, get to watching this. No! Click, 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 click. It's not going to work. Damn. So that's annoying. It's not a bad thing, especially against a strategy such as this, since this strategy does not really rely on your fuel. It relies on you denying your opponent fuel, but you capping fuel should be secondary to you dealing manpower damage and being annoying to your opponent's Panzer Grenadiers. Ay, ay, ay. So, as we see, just trying to keep this green cover right here. Green cover, very, very important in the early game against any sort of Panzer Elite play. You really want to keep your units in cover as much as possible for the obvious defensive bonuses, and the fact that the main early game problem a lot of American players have against PE is the manpower drain, and the fact that Panzer Elite players deal so much damage in such a short period of time that it can be difficult to navigate the US Panzer Elite early game because there's so much damage all the time. And if you make one tiny positional mistake, if you're caught at this red cover when your opponent charges you instead of already at this sandbags, for instance, it can be very, very difficult to actually do any damage, and you'll actually probably take a ridiculous amount of damage yourself instead of dealing damage to your opponent, which is your kind of ideal situation. Now we see right here, if you focus fire Panzer Grenadier squads in equal numbers, rifles actually don't do too poorly. Provided you focus fire, of course, rifles can actually fare decently well against Panzer Grenadiers. Now we saw right there an early incendiary grenade. That's very good news for us as players focused on an infantry-heavy strategy, because that means we are probably not going to see any sort of early vehicle play. And if we do see early vehicle play, it's going to be drastically delayed. This isn't going to be a super hardcore armored car rush, because if it was a super hardcore armored car rush, we wouldn't see any fuel investments in anything but the armored car tech until after the armored car was on the field. In this case, we of course see that that incendiary grenade tech. We can rest a little bit easier. Of course, we don't want to sit back on our laurels too much, because any sort of early vehicle play can be a danger to this strategy and has to be navigated properly in order for the strategy to be a success. So as we see, we're getting the med tent up right here. We have a decent bank of manpower. Might want to get a 4th rifle squad out soon, just because we don't have too many CPs, so we're not even going to be able to call in a paratrooper squad in the too near future. So with that in mind, we're gonna get a triage center up as soon as possible. Gonna get that up right now, and once that's up, we're also gonna be getting a supply yard up. Have the fuel for it and have the manpower for it, obviously. And once that happens, our next priority is going to be that supply yard upgrade, and of course keeping what territory we have and dealing damage, gaining veterancy, which is the #1 currency in the US vs PE late game. The amount of veterancy you have is directly correlated to the amount of success you will have, based on no science at all, but it's fairly obvious to tell how ridiculously important it can be to field enough vetted rifle squads in order to completely negate the advantage that Panzer Grenadiers give the PE faction in terms of infantry, especially in the early game. So as we see right now, got that triage center up, got that supplier up. As we can tell, the slight bank of manpower is coming in handy right here. This is what I was talking about with keeping a slightly larger cushion of manpower than you generally would. You want to be as aggressive as possible with your infantry with this strategy. You're not spending too much manpower on very advanced tech. You're spending it mostly on infantry tech and on tech that will supplement your infantry. So with that in mind, you can spend a lot more manpower on reinforcing, which means you can get on the field a lot quicker with a lot more units and deal a lot more damage in a far shorter time, which are all very good things for a strategy such as this, where you're really trying to maximize your infantry potential and minimize your opponent's ability to really be aggressive with his infantry. As we can see by looking at the game timer right now, 7 minutes. Generally, an armored car rush is going to come before 7 minutes. So we can fairly comfortably say we're probably not going to be facing armored cars. At least not quick armored cars. They might come a little bit later. We're probably going to be facing some sort of Tier 4 tech. Either an AT half-track or a Panzer IV or something like that. Some sort of later game tech that isn't the armored car, and that's perfectly fine. That's absolutely what we want to be facing. What we don't want to be facing is the armored car. The armored car is the strategy that will provide us with a lot of challenges and some difficulties that we won't necessarily feel too comfortable dealing with until we have a lot of experience with it, and with that experience comes time and comes losses. So you're gonna have to be prepared to lose some games. Move. No, you're gonna have to be prepared to lose some games to armored cars with the strategy if you do decide to attempt it, because it takes a little bit of getting used to just how you need to be reacting against an armored car play with a strategy such as this. So at this point, if we look at the unit counting station, we have 4 rifle squads out. We haven't gotten anything out of our med tent, however we are just now starting to fight around the cutoff, so this med tent will start paying off very, very shortly. We have the first supply yard upgrade almost completed. We do have ourselves cut off from the field, which is problematic, because if our opponent does transition into some sort of vehicle-based play that we can't necessarily efficiently combat with paratroopers, which generally is only armored cars, and a delayed armored car play could definitely happen. It is foolish to completely rule out something like that. It's not likely, of course, but it's definitely possible. Now, in a situation like this is when this med tent comes in handy, very much so. Not only are we pushing back the Panzer Grenadiers, dealing a lot of damage to the Panzer Grenadiers, but of course we are doing all of this right beside the med station, so if we do lose squads, lose infantry, we're going to be able to recover that with future zombie squads and stuff like that, which is always good and always nice to have. So at this point, just pushing the Panzer Elite player back a little bit. We still have decent map control, even though we don't have the VPs and we're cut off from this right hand side. It's a simple matter of capping 2 or 3 points in order to have this entire right side back in our possession as the American player. So that's a perfectly acceptable situation to be in. If we notice the munitions right now, very, very high, and this will allow us to get a recoilless rifle squad as soon as possible and as soon as we actually need it. We're also going to want to be getting sticky bombs relatively quickly, and the main reason for that is you want something to supplement the recoilless rifles. You don't just want to be using paratroopers with recoilless rifles as your sole means of AT. You're going to want eventually to have airdropped AT guns, and before that you're going to want sticky bombs, because you need something to slow down the vehicles in order for you to be able to kill them with your paratroopers. The main problem with using infantry-based AT as your primary form of AT is the fact that you can't really chase anything down. You're very, very slow, and you're relatively immobile compared to your opponent's infantry. So you need something to slow it down, or you need something to chase it down. Chase it down would be tanks, which at this point in the game we don't really have the economy to support. And we have a lot of infantry with only 1 supply yard upgrade and not much fuel right now. So chances are we're probably not going to be able to support tank depot tech in the too near future either. So you're going to want sticky bombs, which we have right now, in order to slow down any vehicles. And of course, these are all precautionary measures at this point. When you have a good deal of map control against Panzer Elite, against any faction really, it's not a bad idea to invest in precautionary tech. You sacrifice a bit of your strength in the mid game because you're investing in something that might be completely useless. But provided you have a decent base of map control, which in this case I would say I have more than a decent base. I have an excellent base of map control. I've dealt a lot of manpower damage in the early game, and I am not being countered very hard by what my opponent is doing. In a situation such as this, it's never a bad idea to invest a little bit in defending yourself from being surprised by what your opponent might do. It's far better to spend a little bit of money on sticky bombs and then have your opponent not build vehicles than to get completely caught off guard by vehicles when you don't have sticky bombs at all, and ending up losing either the game or a great deal of manpower because of a situation such as that. So if you're ahead, it's never a bad idea to play conservatively and give up a little bit of that lead in order to ensure you'll be safe later on. Now, as we see, getting bars out, which are going to help against armored cars if we do come up against later armored cars, which of course is unlikely but definitely possible. Obviously, bar is going to help a lot against the Panzer Grenadiers, and we see the Panzer IV infantry support tank. This is a perfectly fine situation for this build. This is a unit that this build is absolutely adequately prepared to deal with. My preferred response, or at least my response in this game, is going to be a second parasquad with recoilless rifles. Paratroopers do fairly well against infantry support tanks. Of course, do well against other tier 4 units such as the AT half-track, and don't do well against armored cars, but that's perfectly fine because our opponent does not have armored cars at this time. So in this situation, what I'm trying to do right now is delay my opponent as much as possible until I can get this second recoilless rifle squad out. I'm going to be moving this para squad in, just trying to deal a little bit of damage. I want to keep this Panzer IV from my rifles and keep it focused on my paras, because my paras are the units that can actually deal damage to it. I want my rifles to be focused on the Panzer Grenadiers, and I want them to be dealing damage to the Panzer Grenadiers and used to support my effort against this tank, of course. But my main objective with my infantry is to deal damage to his infantry, and my main objective of my elite infantry anti-tank is to deal damage to his tanks. So at this point, able to push off the infantry, and I'm going to kill the Panzer IV right there. So at this point, I'm in a very good spot. I'm in an excellent situation. I have a lot of map control. I have a lot of infantry-based tech, and I don't have anything against me that's really going to give me a lot of trouble. So at this point, it pretty much comes down to a fairly standard mid and late game. You're going to want to tech the tank depot if you can afford it and if you need it. In this situation, probably don't really need it right now. If I could afford it, I would probably get it, but at this point in time, I can't really afford it. So I'm not really going to deal or worry too much about that. Of course, also going to want to get a sniper if I can, because obviously my opponent does not have tier 3 or is not building out of tier 3, so the likelihood of armored cars is going to be greatly diminished. I'm going to want to get my second supplier upgrade up once I have the fuel. Of course, that might take a while considering I've been cut off for most of the game, but that's okay. And I'm just going to want to be reacting to everything my opponent does. If my opponent invests more heavily in tanks or in vehicles, I'm going to want to drop a AAT gun from Airborne Company and use that to support my airborne. If he's going to go more infantry heavy, I'm going to want to get a weapon support center up. I'm going to want to get snipers and that kind of jazz. It's a completely standard follow-up to a slightly unorthodox opening that puts you in really, really good shape in terms of infantry by slacking a little bit on your anti-tank. And this does take advantage of some of the tendencies of Panzer Elite players. This patch, a lot of Panzer Elite players have been straight blind countering the fast M8, and that's the reason a lot of American players have been finding a lot of frustration in the matchup, because there's one kind of standard solid American build, and there's a lot of ways the Panzer Elite player can completely hard counter that if they like. Of course, there's a lot of ways for the American player to hard counter that blind counter to the M8, and this is, of course, in my opinion, one of the best ways to counter that kind of mindset, that kind of straight tier 4 tech pattern that a lot of Panzer Elite players really like to do. And we will see a few other instances of slightly less orthodox US versus PE play that works well against both standard PE play and greedy PE play, which this would characterize itself as. Standard PE play would be the fast AC into anti-tank half-track. At least in my opinion, that would be kind of the Panzer Elite standard that we've dealt with for, God, years now. At least 2-3 years, dating back to 2.301 when PE was actually ridiculous and extremely difficult to beat, far more so than it is right now, when it is merely inconvenient and frustrating at times, and mostly because of maps, actually. If you'll notice, a lot of American players are able to beat Panzer Elite players on Stursdorf, Ruins of Ruin, even Langra, with strategies such as this. But that's really all I wanted to show you guys with this strategy. It is a slightly offbeat, slightly risky, not necessarily completely standard, not something I would recommend you try every single game, but absolutely is something you should try to mix into your US versus PE play and at least practice and become proficient at, in case it's something you want to try to incorporate into your play. It's not completely safe, it's not completely standard, it has some difficulties against some Panzer Elite styles, most notably fast armored car, and while there are ways to get around those weaknesses, they're definitely difficult to deal with, and it's definitely something that you're going to have to practice a lot, and not something that I would recommend newer players necessarily try and necessarily spend a lot of time perfecting. I still think and still feel that the standard fast M8 style of play is absolutely completely viable in most situations against most players at most levels. But for those players in the kind of 14, 15, 16 level who are having some difficulties against the standard PE play with their standard American play and want to try to find some ways to spice things up a little bit, I absolutely guarantee you will have a blast trying this strategy. I absolutely guarantee you will have some success with this strategy, and I recommend you at least give it a shot. Try it out, see if you like it, see if it's for you, see if it's not for you, something like that. Give it a chance, see if you like it, and if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you want to ask about it, anything like that, please post in the comments, post on Game Replays, post on the YouTube comments, send me an email, send me a message, anything like that. I will do my best to respond to any and all messages I receive regarding this and any of my other videos. So definitely do not hesitate to ask. And I hope you enjoyed this first in a long-running series of US versus PE case studies that will hopefully improve in quality and in coherence. Hopefully, fingers crossed, as I go about recording more and planning more and all that fun stuff. So, thank you for watching, guys. Let me know how you like this new style. Let me know how you like this new focus, and I will see you guys next time.